Hey guys, tonight we slip back into the streets of medieval Rome, where the air feels heavy with smoke from hearth fires and whispers ride the wind like shadows. You move along cobbled lanes worn smooth by centuries of sandals, horses and restless feet. The city doesn't hum so much as it mutters. Every corner seems to hold a secret, every alley a rumour. Rome has always been a city of spectacle, but tonight's tale leans closer to theatre of the absurd. You're about to witness what happens when politics, piety and pettiness collide, when the grave itself is no safe refuge from a grudge. And yes, you probably won't survive this story if you take it too seriously, but since you're just lying back with a pillow and a blanket, you'll manage. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love picturing this story being whispered across the world. Now, dim the lights, let quiet settle in, and ease yourself into the calm rhythm of tonight's story. You picture yourself strolling along the Tiber, the river glinting with torchlight reflections. The year is 897, though of course you don't bother with a calendar. What you notice is the tension. Even the baker selling flat loaves near the forum looks up too quickly when you approach, as though worried you might ask about the Pope. The latest one, Stephen VI, has made more enemies than friends, and the people of Rome, for all their gossip, are weary of violence. Remember not long ago armies from outside, Frankish and Byzantine, marched here like kids barging into a classroom. Rome is tired and yet restless, and at the centre of that restlessness lies a man who is no longer alive, Formosus. He had been pope before Stephen, ruling for 5 uneasy years. His reign had been a balancing act between powerful factions, nobles, bishops and kings who each thought Rome should bend their way. You hear his name spoken in the taverns with half-curdled wine on lips. Some say he was ambitious, others that he was simply doomed by the tangled politics of Italy. Historians still argue whether he was a schemer or a scapegoat, and you get the sense that both might be true depending on whose parchment you trust. The odd part? He's been dead for months now, buried quietly in St. Peter's Basilica, where pilgrims shuffle through to pray, and yet somehow his story isn't finished. You lean on a stone wall, noticing moss growing between the cracks, and you feel the collective unease of a city that suspects it hasn't heard the last of Formosus. What you don't see, but you might imagine, is how rival factions are already sharpening knives, not against a living opponent, but against his memory. It's one thing to fight a man, it's another to fight the legend of what he represented. And Rome, with its taste for theatre, knows that even the dead can be summoned back onto the stage. The curious thing about medieval Rome is how alive the past always feels. A statue of Caesar crumbles at the edge of the forum, and someone has scrawled a crude cross on it, as if to baptise ancient marble. Old emperors loom in memory, but it's the bishops and popes who command the day now. They wear silks and jewelled mitres, but beneath those robes, they scheme like senators of old. You get the sense that nothing here is ever truly new, it just changes costumes. As you wander farther, you catch the scent of incense drifting from a church, mingling awkwardly with the smell of the fish market. Rome is like that, sacred and profane pressed together so tightly they almost become indistinguishable. A monk hurries by, his sandals slapping against the stone, clutching a parchment that looks far too important for the night air. He doesn't meet your eyes. Nobody seems to meet anyone's eyes tonight. This unease is the quiet prologue to something absurd, something no playwright would dare invent, the trial of a corpse. You pause to let that thought sink in. A trial, with witnesses, with accusations, with a defence. Except the defendant won't be able to speak. He won't even be able to breathe. You'd laugh, except you know how seriously the church takes ritual. For Rome, this will be deadly earnest. By now, word has begun to spread. Pope Stephen VI, wild-eyed and unsteady, has ordered that Formosus's body be dug up. You can imagine the gravediggers' muttered prayers, their lanterns swinging in the crypt, the scrape of stone lids moved aside. A pope doesn't often come back once he's in the ground, and yet here we are. The gossip says Stephen believes Formosus was never truly pope at all, that his consecrations and appointments were invalid, that his very time in office was a fraud. And if that's true, then everything flowing from it, the priests he ordained, the bishops he elevated, crumbles like an ancient wall in the rain. The idea alone makes the Roman clergy jittery. If their ranks are built on illegitimacy, then who has authority left? Imagine being a bishop who suddenly learns the hand that blessed him now lies shriveled in a tomb, and worse, that the blessing might be declared null. That's not just a spiritual crisis. That's career anxiety with incense on top. The ordinary Romans, though, aren't worried about ordinations. They're just morbidly curious. You overhear one woman near the market whispering about whether the corpse will even hold together when hauled into court. Another chuckles nervously that the Pope should have just asked Formosus for a duel, though given the condition of the combatant, the outcome might be one-sided. Rome has a dark sense of humour. So do you, if you're still awake. As you stand listening to these whispers, you realise something. This city thrives on spectacle, no matter how grotesque. The Colosseum may be crumbling, but its spirit is alive in every staged ritual. And the Cadaver Synod, as it will later be called, is about to become the ultimate show. Not lions, not gladiators, just robes, relics, and one unlucky corpse. A scholar centuries later will ask, was Stephen mad or merely desperate? Historians still argue whether this was a burst of paranoia or a calculated political move to secure his papacy. But for you, drifting on the edge of sleep, the debate is just background noise. All you know is that Rome feels unsettled, the cobbles uneasy beneath your steps, the torchlight flickering in drafts you can't quite place. Somewhere in the distance, bells toll. They're not for a funeral, though. That part already happened. What's coming will be stranger. A trial that mocks law while pretending to uphold it. You can almost see the court assembled already. Crimson robes, golden mitres, jewelled crosses glinting in the candlelight. And in the centre, a chair waiting for someone who shouldn't be able to sit in it. You take a breath, the night air cool against your lungs, and sense that the city of Rome is about to witness one of history's strangest performances. And you, somehow, are in the front row. You keep walking, the streets narrowing into twisting lanes where torchlight flickers against plaster walls. In this Rome, rivalry doesn't just live in alleys or marketplaces, it thrives in the palaces of the church. Imagine crimson robes brushing past tapestries, whispers traded in corners where incense curls into shadows. Cardinals, those scarlet-clad princes of the church, scheme as energetically as any Roman senator of centuries past, and right now their ambitions intersect like knives sliding over each other. You picture one of them leaning close to another during a solemn hymn, murmuring about who should rise, who should fall. The irony is rich. Prayers for divine will are sung, while just behind the choir stalls plots are hatched like recipes for stew. Historians still argue whether Pope Stephen VI acted alone in his zeal, or whether a cabal of cardinals egged him on, eager to erase Formosa's influence. What's certain is that power rarely acts without accomplices. You slip through a grand hall in your mind's eye, its marble floors polished to mirror candlelight. Cardinals stand in clusters, gesturing with jewelled fingers, while their attendants hover at the edges like shadows. Here, rivalries simmer. Formosus, when alive, had made choices that angered some and benefited others, appointing bishops in contested lands, cozying up to one faction of nobles while alienating another, and now his corpse is the chess piece being moved on the board. The absurdity is obvious to you, but to them it's deadly serious. If Formosa's acts are declared void, then the bishops he consecrated lose legitimacy. That would mean new opportunities for rival cardinals, new seats of power to fill. Imagine job vacancies being announced not in parchment postings, but in thunderous decrees. Position open, bishopric, lucrative, apply within. You can almost hear the scratching of quills as names are jotted down in anticipation. Yet beneath all this manoeuvring lies a more fragile truth. Rome's clergy live under constant threat. Outside forces, Frankish kings, German rulers, Byzantine envoys, push and pull like impatient children fighting over a toy. Local Roman nobles too expect to steer papal decisions. The Pope himself, for all his authority, sometimes feels less like a sovereign and more like a ringmaster keeping lions from devouring each other. And in this balancing act, alliances matter more than theology. That's the secret you sense as you drift along. Most of these men care less about heavenly doctrine than about earthly security. And perhaps that's why they're willing to tolerate Stephen's madness or madness-tinged strategy. Some may even find it convenient. After all, if a dead rival is discredited, the living can enjoy their new titles with fewer threats. Meanwhile, rumours flit through Rome's taverns and monasteries. One friar claims Stephen wakes screaming from dreams where Formosa's body rises accusingly from its tomb. Another insists the Pope has always been unhinged, prone to ranting fits and sudden rages. A more cynical voice suggests Stephen is perfectly sane, just cruel enough to weaponize the corpse of his rival for political gain. You can't help but smirk. Medieval politics often feel like a soap opera with fewer commercials. But there's also the eerie solemnity of it all. These cardinals draped in scarlet and gold know their decisions ripple outward across Christendom. To them, invalidating Formosus isn't just vengeance, it's rewriting the hierarchy itself. The weight of that thought hangs in the candlelit halls, even as petty rivalries buzz underneath. You picture a cardinal sipping watered wine, calculating how many enemies might be cleared away if Stephen succeeds. In the streets, common folk roll their eyes at the pomp. A baker jokes that if cardinals scheme any harder, they'll need helmets. A water seller shrugs, saying he's seen emperors fall and popes come and go. He'll still be hauling buckets tomorrow. Yet even they sense the unease. Something strange is brewing. The Pope's vendetta isn't just rumour anymore. It's a storm cloud, waiting to break. You find yourself leaning against a colonnade, the stone cool under your palms. You can almost hear the echoes of footsteps as cardinals file into secret chambers. No scrolls are signed in public, no plots declared openly. Instead, the rivalry takes shape behind silk curtains where laughter masks threats and polite words hide daggers. You realise that in Rome, even silence feels political. A fun detail you stumble across in your mental wanderings. Cardinals at the time often used coded gestures and subtle clothing choices to signal alliances. A slightly different hue of red, a certain ring worn prominently. It's like medieval fashion gossip, but with stakes higher than runway shows. Miss the signal, and you might find yourself isolated. Notice it, and you might align with the winning side. Imagine playing poker when the chips are bishoprics and lives. As you let that thought linger, a breeze drifts through the city, carrying with it the sound of chanting from a midnight service. The prayers are for peace, but beneath them hums a different rhythm. Ambition, rivalry, fear. You sense Rome as a city in costume, and tonight the cardinals are the actors most determined to stay in the spotlight. By the time you return to your imagined lodgings, perhaps a candlelit room above a tavern, you feel the weight of all these rivalries pressing down like an extra blanket. And you know, deep down, that when Pope Stephen finally stages his morbid spectacle, it won't just be about Formosus, it will be about every scarlet-robed rival watching from the shadows, waiting to see whether they're next on trial, or next to inherit. The night air clings to you as you wander closer to St. Peter's, the heart of Christendom, its great basilica looming like a stone mountain against the dark. Torches sputter in the courtyards, and soldiers stand with halberds glinting under the flame. But you're not here to admire the basilica's arches or the carved saints frozen in silence. No, you're here because of the whisper that has electrified the city. The body of Formosus, buried months ago, is about to be dragged back into the world of the living, or at least into the theatre of the living. Imagine the crypt beneath the church. Cool, musty air heavy with the scent of damp limestone. Rows of tombs and coffins lie in the half-dark, each holding a man who once bore a crown or a mitre. Candles flicker, throwing long shadows across marble slabs. And in the midst of this quiet, a group of men bend over the resting place of Pope Formosus. Their hands are steady, but their breaths are quick. Gravediggers and attendants whisper prayers under their breath, not out of piety alone, but out of sheer unease. Who wants to disturb a pope's grave, even under papal order? You picture the stone lid groaning open, dust rising like a ghost. The body inside is stiff, shrunken, embalmed but unmistakably dead. Wrapped in what remains of papal vestments, Formosus lies with the still dignity of a man meant to rest in peace. But peace is not what awaits him. Leather straps, ropes, clumsy tools of retrieval are slipped under his frame. The gravediggers murmur apologies to the silence as they hoist him out. And here's where the surreal begins. Instead of being moved discreetly, the body is placed in a chair, stiffly propped upright, dressed again in the papal robes that once marked his office. The tiara is adjusted over what remains of his brow. His fingers, brittle and blackened, are folded together, a corpse dressed for court. It's theatre, grotesque and strange, and you're sitting in the audience. Some chroniclers later insisted the body was in such poor condition that the scene must have been horrifying. Others suggest embalming had preserved him eerily well. Historians still argue whether the trial organisers propped up a nearly intact pontiff or a figure already decaying into dust and bone. Either way, Rome is about to witness a pope summoned back for one final appearance, unwilling though he may be. A priest jokes nervously to his companion that at least Formosus won't object, though his voice dies in the silence of the chamber. You can't help but chuckle softly yourself. Black humour seems to be the only way anyone processes this moment. Above ground, the news spreads faster than wine in a cracked jug. Crowds gather near the basilica, waiting to see if the rumour is true. Some come out of morbid curiosity, others out of anger, still others simply because there's nothing like a scandal to brighten the monotony of a Roman evening. Children climb onto ledges, peasants crane their necks, noblemen whisper from their litters. Rome, never one to resist a spectacle, thrums with anticipation. Inside, attendants prepare the courtroom. A dais for the Pope, benches for the bishops, torches flickering high against vaulted ceilings. The smell of incense doesn't cover the odour that drifts up from the crypt. In the centre, the chair is placed, and into it they strap the body of Formosus, slouched but seated, robed but rotting, a grotesque parody of authority. You can almost hear the scrape of the chair's legs on the stone floor as they position him, centre stage. It's the most bizarre pre-trial preparation you can imagine, and yet here, in Rome, it becomes ritual. Stephen VI, the current pope, paces in his chambers, perhaps muttering curses, perhaps laughing at his own audacity. Some say he was driven by paranoia, others that he wanted to please the faction of nobles and clergy who despised Formosus. Still others whisper that he was possessed by something darker, madness, or perhaps just the intoxicating thrill of power. When the body is ready, the doors are thrown open, and the crowd surges inward, filling the chamber with murmurs. You watch as their eyes widen. There, at the centre of the court, sits a dead pope dressed for judgment. Gasps ripple, followed by nervous chuckles, followed by uneasy silence. No one has ever seen anything like this. You realise you're witnessing a kind of theatre that bends the line between law and farce until it almost snaps. And yet, the absurdity doesn't diminish the danger. This isn't just a joke. For the men sitting in those benches, this is about legitimacy, about power, about rewriting the past to secure the present. If Formosus is declared illegitimate, then everything tied to him collapses like a row of dominoes. Bishops ordained by him might lose their titles, decisions he made might be erased, and above all, Stephen's shaky papacy might gain firmer ground. The scene crystallises in your mind. The corpse of a pope, seated like a puppet in robes, ready to be judged by men who once called him father. The crowd shuffles nervously. Some are horrified, others gleeful, others simply stunned. And you, standing at the edge, can't help but feel you've stepped into a play that Shakespeare would later reject as too implausible. Rome holds its breath. The trial is about to begin, and the star witness won't be able to speak. The crowd inside the basilica sways with anticipation, a restless sea of faces under flickering torchlight. You can feel the warmth of packed bodies, the murmurs rising and falling like the tide. The air is thick. Incense mingles with the unmistakable edge of human sweat, layered with a faint sweet rot that clings to the corpse seated in the centre. There, on a high-backed chair, sits Formosus, or what remains of him, draped in papal vestments, crowned as if ready to preside over Mass. Except this is no Mass. This is a courtroom, and the absurdity of it all hovers over the scene like a strange halo. Stephen VI storms into view, his robes a cascade of crimson, his expression fevered. He moves like a man both exhausted and electrified, his eyes darting over the assembly. You sense in him not calm authority, but the sharp energy of someone possessed. By paranoia, by anger, maybe by both. He climbs onto the dais opposite the corpse, and in that moment you realise the theatre is complete. Pope versus Pope. One living, one dead. The bishops file in, their jewelled rings glinting, their faces a study in discomfort. Some hide their unease behind stiff dignity, others openly frown, as though wishing they were anywhere else, but none dare protest. They take their seats, adjusting their robes, as if small motions might distract from the giant absurdity in the centre of the room. Historians still argue whether their silence was complicity or fear, whether they believed in Stephen's mission, or simply feared being dragged into the grave alongside Formosus' reputation. A clerk, voice trembling, reads the formal charges: treason, ambition, desecration of holy law. The words boom out as though accusing a phantom. You glance at the corpse, its head tilted slightly forward as though listening. The silence that follows each charge feels surreal. A man who cannot defend himself, summoned into this parody of justice. It's the ultimate stacked deck, and yet the ceremony is meticulous. Witnesses are called, though their testimony is largely redundant. Everyone knows the accusations come from Stephen's will, not from evidence. Papers are read aloud, full of Latin legalese that sounds more impressive than convincing. You notice the bishops fidgeting, exchanging glances, some trying to avoid looking at the body at all. In a strange twist, the court appoints a deacon to serve as Formosus' defender. Imagine being that man, standing before a crowd expected to speak on behalf of a corpse that slouches quietly in judgment. He clears his throat, his voice unsteady, as though afraid that at any moment the body might lurch upright. He addresses Formosus as though he were alive, answering the accusations, pleading for his honour. His words tremble like a reed in the wind, but he continues, because to refuse would be unthinkable. The scene borders on comedy, though nobody dares laugh too loudly. A few muffled chuckles rise from the back of the crowd, quickly silenced by nervous coughs. Rome loves a spectacle, but this one hovers on the knife's edge between theatre and nightmare. You smirk despite yourself. Only here, only now, would a corpse need a lawyer. The absurdity doesn't erase the seriousness. Stephen thunders from his throne, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling, declaring Formosus guilty of ambition, of daring to sit on the papal throne when, in Stephen's view, he should never have been allowed to. The crowd shifts uneasily. Ambition in Rome is hardly unique. To accuse a dead man of it feels like accusing the Tiber of flowing too wide. Still, Stephen rages on, pointing a trembling finger at the corpse, as though it might rise and argue back. Some later chroniclers will claim that Stephen's hatred was personal, that he felt overshadowed by Formosus, even haunted by him. Others suggest the trial was pure politics, designed to wipe out every trace of his rival's influence. Historians still debate whether madness or calculation drove this spectacle. As you watch, you feel it might be both, woven together into a single fevered act. The crowd watches in stunned silence, broken only by the occasional gasp when Stephen's accusations grow more intense. He accuses Formosus of violating canon law by leaving his bishopric for Rome, of conspiring with enemies of the city, of desecrating the very order of the church. Each charge feels more like a dagger thrown at a ghost than a legal argument, and through it all, the corpse sits, unmoving, tilted as though weary of the whole affair. You imagine, for a moment, that the stillness is defiance, that Formosus refuses to give Stephen the satisfaction of reaction. In that silence, there's almost dignity. Almost. The bishops shuffle papers, nodding solemnly as though any of this makes sense. The deacon's voice wavers on, pleading, contradicting, defending. It's as though the whole court has entered a trance where the impossible is normalised. You can't help but think of children playing courtroom with dolls, except here the doll is the embalmed body of a pope. A few people in the crowd slip out muttering that the whole affair is cursed. Others press closer, eager not to miss a moment. Rome is divided between horror and fascination, a city caught between respect for the papacy and delight in scandal. And you, drifting deeper into this surreal narrative, sense the absurd trial tightening like a noose. The candles burn lower, shadows stretch longer, and Stephen's fury shows no sign of cooling. The courtroom of the absurd is in full swing, and the verdict, though not yet declared, feels inevitable. You can already hear the next steps forming in Stephen's fevered mind: humiliation, degradation, destruction. And through it all, the corpse of Formosus remains, the most patient defendant in history, waiting for the living to exhaust themselves. The court falls quiet, as if everyone collectively realises how impossible this theatre has become. There's the corpse, cloaked in papal vestments, sitting slumped in the chair, and then there's the deacon, a living man sweating under the weight of his bizarre assignment. You watch him shuffle his parchments with trembling fingers, each rustle echoing too loudly in the cavernous space. His face is pale, his eyes dart nervously toward the corpse he now represents. He has been given the impossible task: speak for the dead. Defend a pope who cannot blink, cannot breathe, cannot even object. The deacon clears his throat, his voice thin at first, then growing firmer as he remembers the gravity of his role. He addresses the court with words that sound oddly formal in such an absurd setting. On behalf of my Lord Pope Formosus. He stops, perhaps realizing how ridiculous that sounds, but presses on. What else can he do? The room ripples with murmurs. Some snicker quietly. How can one man presume to speak for a corpse? Others lean forward with solemn attention, as though waiting to see whether God himself will animate the dead pontiff in a miracle of protest. Historians still argue whether this deacon believed he was preserving honour or simply following orders to save his own skin. Either way, he is the voice of the voiceless, a puppet master for the silent pope. You watch his performance unfold. He argues against the charges, pointing out that many popes before Formosus had shifted bishoprics, that ambition was hardly unique to one man. He insists that consecrations performed by Formosus are valid, that the sacrament, once given, cannot be revoked by retroactive judgment. His arguments, shaky though they may be, draw on centuries of canon law, the kind of stuff theologians argue about in cloisters while sipping weak wine. But as he speaks, the weight of the situation presses down. Every glance toward the corpse reminds him, and everyone else, that his words echo into silence. It's like arguing with an empty chair, except this chair holds a decaying body in ceremonial robes. The sight gnaws at him, and you sense he wishes desperately for the ground to swallow him whole. At one point the deacon turns slightly toward Formosus, as though expecting a nod of approval. The audience stirs, some stifling laughter, others muttering prayers. The absurdity cuts so close to comedy that even you can't help but grin. You think to yourself, only in Rome could a dead man require a defence attorney, and only in this Rome would someone be brave or desperate enough to play the role. Stephen VI glares down at the deacon, his face flushed with fury. To him, this isn't a game. He interrupts, shouting accusations, demanding that the deacon answer for Formosus' sins. His voice rises until it echoes in the rafters, a storm of condemnation. The deacon flinches with each outburst, but stubbornly continues, mumbling about tradition, about sacred rites, about the dignity of the office of pope. You almost admire him. Here's a man trying to maintain a shred of dignity in a courtroom that lost its dignity the moment the corpse was seated. Later, chroniclers claimed the deacon spoke in a quavering tone, each word punctuated by his own fear that Stephen might turn on him next. And truly, you sense that possibility in the air. One wrong phrase, one hint of disloyalty, and this man could find himself in the same grave he helped disturb. The court watches him closely, not with sympathy but with the wary curiosity of spectators, wondering whether the juggler will drop his torch and set himself aflame. At one point, he leans into pathos, insisting that the Pope, even in death, retains the dignity of his office. You imagine the silence that follows, broken only by the creak of wood as the corpse shifts slightly in its chair. The audience gasps softly, convinced for a moment that Formosus himself might rise to object. But no, it's just the strap settling. Still, the moment sends shivers down spines. You chuckle at the dark irony. Here is a deacon arguing about dignity, while the body of his client is literally strapped up and paraded like a prop. Rome has never been short on contradictions, and tonight's scene might be the crown jewel of them all. The crowd, restless and divided, reacts in unpredictable ways. Some nod along, appreciating the attempt at legal seriousness. Others sneer, muttering that the man defends a fraud, a traitor, a pretender. Children, seated cross-legged at the back, whisper about whether the corpse will suddenly start speaking Latin. Rome has always mixed solemnity with spectacle, and tonight it's impossible to tell whether the city is witnessing justice or theatre. The deacon's voice cracks toward the end. He repeats himself, circling back to the same arguments, perhaps because he's run out of material, perhaps because he knows the verdict is already decided. He finishes with a trembling declaration that Formosus was the rightful pope, that the charges are unjust, and that condemning him dishonours the papacy itself. He bows his head, sweat dripping, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. For a brief moment, silence reigns. You almost wonder if his words might have softened the room, if dignity might momentarily outweigh absurdity. But then Stephen rises, his eyes blazing, and the storm resumes. The deacon has done his duty, but the trial grinds on, deaf to reason, deaf to mercy. You lean back in your imagined seat, feeling the surreal heaviness of the moment. A corpse defended by a trembling man, a pope raging against his predecessor's ghost, and an audience unsure whether to laugh, pray, or cry. And through it all, you drift further into the strangeness, lulled by the absurd cadence of history's darkest comedy. The courtroom buzzes again, as though the air itself has grown impatient. The deacon's quavering voice has faded, his last offence swallowed by silence, and now Stephen VI seizes the stage. He rises with a flourish, his robes pooling around his feet like a tide of scarlet. His eyes flash, his jaw tight, his finger stabbing the air as if each motion alone might condemn his rival's memory. You feel the tension spike as the true heart of the trial is revealed, the litany of accusations, the thunderous charges that will hammer Formosus' reputation into dust. Ambitio, Stephen's voice cracks across the room like a whip. The word echoes from stone walls, bouncing back at the corpse in its chair. Ambition, greed, lust for power, these are the first blows. Formosus, Stephen declares, never should have been pope. He was Bishop of Porto, and canon law forbade a bishop from abandoning his seat for another. By ascending to the papal throne, Formosus had violated sacred law, spitting on the church's order. You imagine the bishops squirming in their seats. They all know this particular law has been stretched and ignored in other cases. Plenty of clerics had shifted seats when ambition suited them. Historians still argue whether this accusation was rooted in genuine canonical concern or just a pretext Stephen exploited. Either way, the sight of a corpse being accused of career hopping is both surreal and absurd. You half expect someone to stand and say, "Don't we all want promotions?" But no one dares break the solemn madness. Then comes the darker charge, betrayal of Christendom. Stephen declares that Formosus, in his ambition, conspired with outside powers, inviting foreign rulers to meddle in Rome's affairs. His voice rises in fury as he denounces Formosus for courting the Carolingian kings, for meddling in Italian politics, for sowing division. To Stephen, this isn't just ambition, it's treason. You can almost hear the gasps ripple through the crowd as he paints the dead pope as an enemy of Rome itself. Here, the drama intensifies. To accuse a pope of treason is no small thing. For the people in the crowd, many of whom had benefited or suffered under Formosus' decisions, the words land heavily. Some nod grimly, convinced the charges are true. Others frown, whispering that Stephen himself seems more treasonous, dragging the dignity of the papacy into spectacle. A baker near the back mutters that Rome's leaders argue like fishmongers, only with bigger hats. And then, the charge that stings most for the clergy, illegal consecrations. Stephen thunders that every bishop and priest ordained by Formosus was invalid. Imagine the cold sweat of men sitting in the courtroom, hearing that their authority, their very priesthood, might be wiped out with a single decree. The hand that blessed them, Stephen claims, had no right to do so. You can sense the terror ripple through them. If Formosus' acts are void, their lives unravel in an instant. The deacon, still standing awkwardly at his post, protests weakly. He insists that once a sacrament is performed, it cannot be undone, no matter the legality of the priest. But his voice is swallowed by Stephen's rage. The Pope slams his hand on the arm of his chair, his voice rising into near shrieks. He doesn't want debate. He wants destruction. A historian centuries later will note that Stephen's tirade reveals more about his own insecurity than about Formosus' supposed crimes. Historians still argue whether Stephen truly believed in these charges or simply wielded them as weapons to secure power. For you, sitting quietly in the candlelit chaos, the effect is both chilling and bizarre. The crowd's reaction shifts like a tide. Some spectators lean forward eagerly, hungry for every scandalous word. Others whisper that the charges feel hollow, a performance more than a judgment. One old woman near the front crosses herself repeatedly, muttering prayers as though afraid that listening to the trial itself might bring down a curse. Children, restless and wide-eyed, tug at their mothers' sleeves, whispering questions about whether the dead pope might suddenly leap up in anger, and you, half dreaming in the absurd spectacle, can't help but note how this trial says as much about the living as it does about the dead. Stephen rants. The bishops watch with dread. The crowd hangs on every word. Formosus, stiff in his chair, remains the calmest of them all. Somewhere in the midst of this thunderous barrage, a torch sputters, its smoke curling into the rafters. The shadows shift across the corpse's face, making it look for one eerie instant as though Formosus smirks at the whole ordeal. You blink, shake it off, just a trick of the flame. But the thought lingers, perhaps in silence. The dead pope has the last laugh. By the time Stephen finishes, his voice hoarse, the charges hang heavy in the air. Treason, ambition, desecration. Each accusation is a nail driven into the coffin already sitting open in the crypt below. And yet, you sense the absurdity has reached a kind of fever pitch. The living scream, the crowd gasps, the deacon pleads, and the dead remain unmoved. The courtroom trembles with anticipation of the next act. The charges are declared. Now comes the punishment, the spectacle that will strip away every shred of dignity left to a man who cannot raise a hand in protest. You feel the story press forward, the strange rhythm of medieval theatre quickening like a drumbeat, and you know, even as you listen, that this is only the middle of the performance. The most grotesque scenes are still to come. The air in the basilica feels restless, almost alive with whispers that skitter like mice across stone floors. You tilt your head and hear the murmurs building outside in the streets where Rome gathers to witness what has become the strangest event of the age. News has spread faster than bread on market day. The Pope has put his dead predecessor on trial, and everyone wants to see what happens next. Picture the scene outside St. Peter's. The square teems with people. Peasants from the countryside, merchants with baskets under their arms, noblemen peeking down from their litters, and children climbing onto statues just to glimpse the doors. The scent of sweat, fish, and roasting chestnuts blends with the drifting sweetness of incense from within. The city, always hungry for spectacle, has turned up in droves. Some come out of anger, muttering that Pope Stephen has gone too far. Others come out of morbid curiosity, eager to say they were there when Rome staged the strangest trial in history. Inside, the atmosphere is no calmer. The courtroom swells with a mix of clergy, nobles, and ordinary onlookers allowed in. You can feel the tension thick as wool, prickling at your skin. People crane their necks to see the corpse on its throne, and every time the chair creaks, the crowd gasps as though the dead pope might spring to life. What you notice most is the strange duality of the crowd. Some faces are pinched with horror, hands clutched tight around rosaries as though trying to block out the blasphemy of it all. Others are smirking, elbowing their neighbours, treating this like the latest form of entertainment. Historians still argue whether the Roman mob secretly loved this grotesque theatre, or whether it planted the seeds of outrage that would soon erupt. Perhaps it was both. Delight in scandal first, indignation later. A woman near the front whispers that the corpse still has dignity in its silence, while the living pope rages like a madman. A man beside her scoffs, saying dignity doesn't matter if a man was never rightful pope in the first place. Their argument hisses back and forth until a guard silences them with a glare. You smile inwardly at the thought that even the audience can't decide whether to laugh or pray, and of course, the rumours swirl wildly. Some whisper that strange omens have already appeared. Crows circling over the basilica, a blood-red sunset the night before, a sudden gust of wind that knocked over a cross in the forum. Rome is a city that sees signs everywhere, and tonight every creak of wood or flicker of flame feels charged with meaning. From your place among the crowd, you catch snippets of gossip about the Pope himself. One man insists Stephen hasn't slept in days, pacing the papal apartments, muttering to himself about demons. Another claims he drinks heavily before each session of the trial, his voice fueled more by wine than by righteousness. A third swears Stephen's eyes glow with madness, and though you know that's impossible, the thought lingers as you watch him glare at the corpse as though it might attack him. You notice how the crowd reacts not just to the trial but to one another. Small groups form at the edges, hissing debates about whether Stephen is right or wrong. A few shout insults at the corpse. Traitor. Pretender. Their voices thin with false courage. Others mutter prayers under their breath, convinced this trial mocks God himself. And the children, of course, giggle and whisper, pointing at the strange puppet-like figure strapped to a chair in full papal robes. Rome has always loved a performance. Centuries earlier, gladiators fought in the Colosseum while crowds cheered or jeered. Tonight, the corpse of a pope fills the role of combatant, and the audience can't look away. It's not swords and blood, but robes and words, and somehow it's just as gripping. You smirk at the thought. Only in this city could a corpse draw a bigger crowd than a chariot race. And only in this century could the audience be so split, half entertained, half horrified, all unable to leave. The tension isn't limited to the common folk. The clergy, seated at the front, glance nervously between Stephen and the body. Some are pale, as if already imagining their own fate should they fall out of favour. Others mask their faces in solemn masks, but their fidgeting hands betray the anxiety beneath. If Stephen invalidates Formosus, what does that mean for them? Their ordinations, their power, their future, it could all unravel in an instant. You catch sight of one bishop whispering furiously to another, his jewelled fingers twitching as though counting the costs. Perhaps he owes his office to Formosus's hand. Perhaps he fears that in the Pope's zeal, his own title will be torn away. Either way, the courtroom hums with a quiet terror that no one dares speak aloud. And then, the crowd surges slightly forward as Stephen's voice booms again, calling for order, demanding silence. His words echo against the walls, feeding the audience's fear and fascination alike. He doesn't just want to condemn Formosus, he wants the entire city to bear witness, to see this as justice rather than lunacy. And Rome, true to form, plays its part. Spectators leaning closer, priests wringing their hands, children whispering behind their mothers' cloaks. It is in this moment that you realise the trial is no longer confined to law or theology. It has become pure theatre, a spectacle staged for the masses, the courtroom transformed into something halfway between a holy tribunal and a carnival sideshow. And you, standing quietly among the crowd, know that this city will never forget what it has seen. The murmurs, the whispers, the laughter, the prayers, all of it is part of the verdict already being written, not just in parchment, but in the memory of Rome itself. The trial has reached a rhythm now, as though it were less a court and more a play unfolding on a stage. The crowd, restless and fascinated, leans forward as Pope Stephen VI, flushed with triumph, gestures to the attendants. His voice, hoarse from shouting, cuts through the chamber. The moment of symbolic punishment has arrived. The corpse, silent all this time, is about to be stripped of its dignity. You watch as clerics, faces pale with dread, shuffle forward. They hesitate before the seated body of Formosus, as though half expecting him to suddenly protest. The corpse, of course, does nothing. Its brittle frame slumps under the heavy vestments, papal robes gleaming dully under torchlight. Then, with trembling hands, the attendants begin to undo the garments one by one. First, the stole is lifted from his shoulders, then the ornate chasuble, its gold thread dulled by time. Layer by layer, the trappings of office are peeled away. Each removal is punctuated by Stephen's booming accusations, as if the very cloth carried the weight of guilt. The tiara, once a symbol of authority, is yanked off last, leaving the body's head bare, tilting forward in a grim parody of humility. The crowd gasps. Some murmur prayers, others whisper mockingly. To them, this is more than humiliation, it's desecration, a statement that the very office of Formosus was false. You can feel the unease ripple outward like a chill draught in the candlelight. It's a strange spectacle, almost ritualistic. Rome has always known the power of symbols, and here, stripping a corpse carries more weight than any shouted verdict. A living man might resist, cling to his dignity, but Formosus, silent and slouched, must endure the ceremony in stillness. You imagine him, in some distant realm, rolling his eyes at the absurdity of it all. And here's a detail that sticks with you. Chroniclers claim that after the vestments were stripped, attendants replaced them with rough monks' robes, the clothing of penitents. Imagine it. A dead pope dressed down to resemble a humble friar, as if mocking him with one final costume change. Historians still argue whether this detail was true or exaggerated later, but either way, the image clings like cobwebs in your mind. The bishops in the audience shift uncomfortably. For them, this is not just a theatrical humiliation, it's a warning. If a pope himself can be stripped bare in death, what security do they have in life? Their titles, their robes, their authority? What protects them if Stephen decides their legitimacy is also a sham? You sense a collective shiver move through their ranks, and of course the Roman mob responds in its own way. Some jeer openly, enjoying the grotesque theatre. Others groan in disgust, muttering that the Pope has gone mad. Children laugh nervously, pointing at the slumped figure that now looks more like a dressed-up scarecrow than a pontiff. You chuckle quietly too, because even in this horror, there's an undeniable absurdity, like a puppet show that's gotten out of hand. The stripping also carried a deeper meaning. In medieval ritual, removing vestments wasn't just about clothes, it was about erasing the sacred identity tied to them. Without his papal garments, Formosus was no longer seen as a pope, not even in death. He was just a body, a symbol undone. You realise the cruelty lies not in the act itself, but in its intent, to annihilate a man's legacy while pretending it was a legal judgment. Stephen VI watches with satisfaction, his chest heaving as though each stripped layer is a victory. His voice rises in shrill condemnation, repeating the charges as the garments fall. It's as though he's exorcising Formosus by unravelling him piece by piece. Yet paradoxically, the more he shouts, the more the silence of the corpse seems to overshadow him. The dead pope doesn't fight back, doesn't plead, doesn't rage. He just sits, and somehow that stillness feels like resistance. You imagine the absurdity of it sinking into the crowd, a pope denouncing a pope, garments tossed onto the floor like discarded costumes, and in the middle, a corpse that endures more calmly than any of the living. For a moment, you wonder if the Roman people see who really looks ridiculous in this play. Then, a murmur ripples outward. Someone near the back mutters that the trial is cursed, that stripping a corpse will bring God's wrath. A priest crosses himself repeatedly. Another spectator chuckles and says God probably left this courtroom hours ago. You smile at that too. It's hard not to. Yet the stripping is only the beginning. Rome has always loved escalation, and Stephen, lost in his fury, has no intention of stopping here. Soon the humiliation will grow darker, crueler, and stranger. You can already sense the crowd bracing for whatever comes next, leaning forward in horrified fascination. The robes lie discarded, the body slumped, the theatre pressing forward. Rome holds its breath, waiting for the next absurd act in this grim performance. The silence after the stripping doesn't last long. Stephen VI, pacing like a caged wolf, isn't satisfied with mere humiliation. His eyes blaze as he gestures toward the corpse, voice rising into the rafters. "The hand!" he thunders. You feel the crowd stiffen, understanding at once what he means. The right hand, the one used for blessings, for consecrations, for ordaining priests and bishops. That hand, Stephen declares, is guilty. Two attendants approach Formosus with visible hesitation. You imagine their hands shaking as they grip the frail, rotting wrist. The fingers are stiff, darkened by death, but still recognisable as the hand that once traced the sign of the cross over countless men. The attendants exchange nervous glances. They're not executioners, yet they've been ordered to perform something between ritual and mutilation. One of them pulls a knife. The scrape of metal echoes oddly in the cavernous basilica. You hear a collective intake of breath from the crowd. Some mutter prayers, others gasp, a few even laugh nervously, unable to believe what they're seeing. You can almost feel the air tighten around you, as though even the stones of the church object to what's about to happen. With a sharp motion, the attendants sever 3 fingers from Formosus's right hand, the index, middle, and ring finger, the ones used in blessings and consecrations. They clatter to the floor like brittle twigs, and the sound seems far too loud for such small objects. The crowd erupts in whispers and gasps. Children squeal, mothers turn away, and one priest covers his face, trembling. This was no arbitrary cruelty. In medieval symbolism, those 3 fingers held deep meaning. They were the physical channel of sacred authority, the instruments of ordination. By cutting them away, Stephen sought to erase not just Formosus' deeds, but the very possibility that his consecrations had ever been valid. It was as if he were declaring, every blessing this man gave is cut off, null, undone. And yet, the symbolism cuts both ways. To the faithful, the act is horrifying, sacrilegious. To mutilate the hand of a pope, even a dead one, seems to mock God himself. Historians still argue whether Stephen realised how his theatrics would backfire, that his attempt to destroy Formosus' legacy would instead outrage the very people he sought to control. From the crowd comes a voice, sharp and angry. "Blasphemy!" Guards shove the man back into silence. But the murmur has already spread. Some spectators mutter darkly, others nod grimly, as though realizing this trial has crossed a line. You can feel the mood shifting, fascination giving way to unease, and unease hardening toward anger. And yet, there are still those who treat it like theatre. One boy, perched on his father's shoulders, whispers loudly, "Will they cut off his toes next?" His father hushes him, but a ripple of chuckles passes through the crowd, a moment of macabre levity. Rome has always known how to laugh at horror, even if the laughter masks fear. You notice the deacon, still standing nearby, looking pale as wax. His task had been to defend Formosus, but now he looks broken, his eyes fixed on the severed fingers on the stone floor. What words could possibly matter after such a gesture? His lips move, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in disbelief. Meanwhile, Stephen VI looks triumphant. His face glows with a feverish satisfaction, as though he's just performed a sacred act of purification. He gestures to the crowd, shouting again about Formosa's crimes, insisting the mutilation proves his illegitimacy. You wonder if he realizes he's convincing fewer and fewer people that the spectacle has begun to look more like madness than justice. The severed fingers are gathered, wrapped in cloth, and taken away. Whether to be discarded or preserved as grisly trophies, no one knows. Chroniclers later disagreed. Some claim they were thrown aside like trash, others insisted they were hidden as relics by sympathetic clergy. Either way, the gesture lingers in the mind like an image burned by fire. You can't help but smirk grimly at the absurdity. A courtroom where evidence is not words or scrolls, but fingers hacked from a corpse. Only in Rome, only in this feverish century could justice be reduced to such grotesque theatre. The crowd shifts again, the murmurs louder now, tinged with unease. People glance toward one another as if asking silently, how far will this go? Some slip out into the night, muttering that they want no part in whatever curse this trial might summon. Others press closer, too fascinated to leave, their eyes wide with horrified curiosity. And you, watching in silence, realize the cadaver synod has tipped from farce into horror. The spectacle has crossed into something darker, something that can't be undone. Stephen may think he's won, but the crowd's unease tells you otherwise. The hand of Formosus lies mutilated, the sacred authority it once carried declared null. But history doesn't bend so easily. You know, even if Stephen doesn't, that this act will haunt him and Rome, long after the last torch sputters out. The trial has already descended into grotesque spectacle, yet somehow Stephen VI finds a way to drive it further. The mutilation of the corpse should have ended the drama, but instead it fuels his fury. His voice, ragged now from hours of tirades, swells again as he rises from his chair. His robes sway heavily, and you can almost see the veins in his neck pulsing as he points a trembling finger toward Formosus's slumped body. The courtroom falls quiet, waiting. The deacon, pale and defeated, lowers his gaze. The bishops shift uncomfortably, their jewelled hands clasped tight, as if bracing themselves for the inevitable. Outside, the restless crowd presses closer, their whispers spilling through the half-open doors. The torches flicker, and the air feels thick, smoky, sour, and heavy with anticipation. And then, with the dramatic certainty of a man who believes himself an instrument of divine wrath, Stephen declares the verdict. Guilty. Guilty of ambition. Guilty of betraying the church. Guilty of every crime he has flung into the air. His words ring out not just as judgment on one dead pope, but as a rewriting of history itself. The crowd erupts, but not in the way Stephen hopes. There's no triumphant cheer, no collective sigh of agreement. Instead, there's a confused swell of sound, gasps, mutters, even angry shouts. Some call the verdict just, others hiss curses under their breath. You hear someone laugh in disbelief, and another sob as though the whole church has been desecrated before their eyes. Inside, the bishops bow their heads, murmuring their assent, but their eyes tell another story. You can see fear etched into their faces, fear that their own ordinations might be invalidated, that their own positions might unravel. Historians still argue whether their silence made them complicit, or whether they were prisoners of circumstance, trapped by a mad pope's fury. Either way, their nods feel more like survival than conviction. Stephen isn't finished. He orders the body stripped of all papal authority, its deeds declared void. He screams that every ordination performed by Formosus is invalid. His words strike like thunder, shattering the fragile calm of the basilica. The priests and bishops seated nearby glance at each other in panic. Some have built their entire careers on Formosa's blessing. To declare them illegitimate is to pull the rug out from under the entire church. You notice how the tension spreads like fire through the audience. Some whisper fiercely that Stephen has gone too far, that God will punish such arrogance. Others chuckle nervously, shaking their heads as though watching a drunk man stumble through a tavern performance. Rome has always thrived on spectacle, but now the spectacle feels dangerous, like a torch being swung too close to dry timber. And then, outside, a ripple of laughter breaks into outrage. A man shouts, "He condemns the dead!" Will he try the stones next? The crowd roars, half with laughter, half with fury. Guards shove people back, but the muttering grows louder. Rome's patience is wearing thin. Inside, Stephen raises his arms as though he's a gladiator basking in applause. He doesn't notice the unease, or worse, he doesn't care. He sees only his triumph, his rival disgraced, his enemies cowed. Yet to the watching crowd, his triumph looks like madness. You can't help but think of the irony. The corpse sits in silent dignity, while the living pope rages like a man possessed. Who appears guilty now? Formosus, motionless and mute, or Stephen, shrieking his judgment into the shadows? It's a question Rome will carry long after this night. Later, writers will describe the verdict as thunderous, shocking, infamous. Historians still debate whether it was Stephen's madness or his faction's pressure that pushed him to declare such a sweeping condemnation. But standing there, in the candlelit chamber filled with mutters and gasps, you sense the verdict has already slipped out of his control. The bishops nod, the verdict is sealed, the trial is over. Yet the crowd lingers, buzzing with unease, anger and disbelief. A corpse has been tried and found guilty, but the living, the spectators, the clergy, the Roman people, are the ones left haunted, and you, listening quietly in the shadows, know that this grotesque theatre has not ended. The verdict may have been thundered, but the story is far from finished. Rome's streets will carry the echo of this night, and the backlash it stirs will soon engulf even Stephen himself. For now, though, the crowd files out into the dark Roman night, voices swirling with outrage and ridicule alike. The cadaver synod has delivered its verdict, and in doing so, it has carved a wound into the church that no decree can easily heal. The verdict has been thundered, the charges spat, the corpse stripped and mutilated. You would think that would be the end of it. Yet Stephen VI, still feverishly restless, refuses to let the grotesque theatre close on a courtroom finale. No, he demands an encore, one final act of degradation that will echo across Rome. The attendants, pale and trembling, are ordered to take the body away. You watch as they unstrap Formosus from the chair, his frame stiff and brittle, his robes hanging loosely over bones and shriveled flesh. The crowd shifts, a mixture of relief and dread, as though wondering if at last the nightmare is over. But Stephen isn't finished. He rises again, his voice cracking as he commands the body be dragged through the basilica and out into the streets, and so it begins, the macabre procession. Down the steps, through the torchlit square, the corpse of a pope is hauled. You hear the scrape of bone against stone, the muffled thuds as the attendants struggle to carry what they no longer treat with reverence. The Roman mob, who once gathered with morbid curiosity, now gasps in horror as the spectacle spills from church to street. Children scream, women cross themselves, and men mutter angrily. A few laugh bitterly, but the laughter feels thin, frightened. The torchlight throws grotesque shadows across the body, making it lurch and sway like some grim marionette. You can't help but think of Rome's older days, when gladiators were dragged from the arena in spectacle. The city, it seems, has found a new form of cruelty to applaud, or to abhor. The procession doesn't end in burial or even quiet disposal. No, Stephen decrees that Formosus shall be denied the peace of the tomb. His body, once placed in sacred ground, is now to be hurled into the Tiber. The river, eternal and indifferent, will become his coffin. The attendants reach the banks, the moon glinting silver on the water's surface. The Tiber murmurs darkly, its current swollen with autumn rains. The body is raised awkwardly, like a sack of grain, and with one final heave it is cast into the river's black embrace. The splash is muffled but decisive. Ripples spread outward, catching torchlight in fractured patterns, before fading into darkness. The crowd gasps and then murmurs like thunder. Some cheer, believing justice has been done, their rival pope consigned to oblivion. But others recoil in horror. To deny a man, even a pope, burial in holy ground is sacrilege. To treat a pontiff's body like refuse is blasphemy. You hear a man mutter fiercely, "Not even Nero dared this." The bitterness in his voice is echoed by many. And yet, the story doesn't end with the splash. Legends soon spread that the body of Formosus did not rest in the river. Some say fishermen found him days later, tangled in their nets. Others insist his corpse washed ashore, still robed in fragments of vestments, and that miracles occurred at the spot. Pilgrims, they claim, gathered to touch the remains, whispering that even in death, Formosus carried divine power. Historians still argue whether these tales were propaganda spun by his supporters or genuine reports of popular devotion. But for the people of Rome, the legend was enough. The Tiber could not silence Formosus. In your mind's eye, you see the river swallowing the body, carrying it past arches and under bridges, its dark current whispering secrets to the city that watches silently from its banks. Rome has always lived beside the Tiber, drawing strength from it, fearing its floods. Tonight, the river becomes a witness to injustice, a mute recorder of madness. You can feel the atmosphere shifting in the city. The trial, once treated as bizarre entertainment, now festers in the hearts of Romans as a wound. Casting the Pope's body into the Tiber is not just spectacle, it's insult, a desecration too far. People mutter that God will avenge this blasphemy. Some already whisper about rebellion, about pulling Stephen from his throne and throwing him into the same waters. As the crowd disperses, the mood is no longer one of fascination but of fury. Men clutch their cloaks tighter, women whisper prayers as they hurry home, and children once giggling at the corpse now cry softly against their mother's skirts. You realise that Stephen, in his zeal, has overreached. The grotesque theatre has shifted the people against him, and you, standing at the river's edge in your imagination, watch the ripples fade. The water closes over the body, indifferent and eternal. But you know the story is not finished. Rome does not forget. The Tiber may carry Formosus away, but the memory of this night will rise again, stronger than any current. The Tiber swallows the corpse, but the city does not swallow its outrage. As the ripples fade into darkness, so too does the crowd disperse into Rome's winding streets. Yet the murmurs don't die. They grow, carried on the night air, repeated in taverns and whispered in cloisters. Rome is restless now, its people unsettled by what they've seen. You walk through those streets in your mind, the moon casting long shadows across the cobblestones. At one corner, a merchant shakes his head furiously, declaring that Stephen has cursed the city. God won't tolerate this, he mutters. At another, a group of peasants huddle close, recounting how the Pope ordered the corpse mutilated before tossing it into the river. One of them spits, saying he'd never thought he'd live to see such blasphemy. Another shakes his head and murmurs, "Not even Nero mocked the dead like this." In taverns, the story grows wilder with every retelling. Some insist the corpse floated back upstream, defying the current. Others swear fishermen spotted Formosus drifting under the moonlight, his hand raised in blessing despite its missing fingers. The truth hardly matters. What matters is the unease, the sense that something unnatural has been done. Historians still argue whether these stories reflect genuine sightings or the collective imagination of a horrified city. You suspect it was both. Fear and faith are often twins in Rome. The clergy too stir with unease. Bishops who once sat silently during the trial now whisper their dissent in safer corners. Many of them had been ordained by Formosus, and Stephen's decree had cast their legitimacy into doubt. Imagine the cold fear of a man who wakes each morning unsure whether he's still a bishop in the eyes of God, or whether his entire life's vocation has been undone by a single mad trial. You picture them pacing in their chambers, wringing their hands, whispering prayers tinged with desperation. Among the ordinary Romans, anger grows alongside fear. They might mock and jeer at authority when safe, but this time their indignation feels sharper, more dangerous. You hear mutters about rebellion, about tearing Stephen from his throne. Rome is a city that has endured emperors, tyrants, and invaders. It knows when patience has worn thin. One curious thing, chroniclers note that miracles were soon reported where the body of Formosus washed ashore. Pilgrims whispered that the corpse, despite its mutilation, carried a strange holiness. Some claimed to see a faint light hovering over the water, others swore prayers spoken at the riverbank were answered. Whether true or invented, these tales fueled popular devotion, turning Formosus from disgraced pope into martyr. You smirk, realizing how often history flips villains into saints, all depending on who tells the story. In the markets, the backlash is sharper. A fishmonger complains that the Tiber is cursed now, that casting the pope's body into it has poisoned the water. Housewives murmur that they fear to wash their laundry by the banks, lest the spirit of Formosus drag them down. Even the children, once amused, now tell each other ghost stories. The Pope who rose from the water, dripping and wrathful, pointing with his severed hand. Meanwhile, in the palaces of the nobles, the muttering grows bolder. Some are disliked Formosus in life, but even they blanch at the excesses of Stephen's vengeance. To them, the cadaver synod reeks of instability. If a pope can be tried after death, then no man's legacy is safe. Power in Rome is already fragile. Stephen has shaken the very foundations. You stroll past the Lateran Palace in your imagination, and you hear it too. The uneasy quiet of guards who know they serve a ruler losing control. They stand at their posts, but their eyes shift nervously toward the city, where outrage stirs like a storm. Rome is not loyal to Stephen anymore. It is watching, waiting, ready to erupt. One night, as you drift deeper into the story, you imagine a small group gathered by torchlight near the forum. Their voices are hushed, but their anger sharp. They speak not just of outrage, but of action. The Pope mocks God, one whispers. If he dares this, what will he do next? Another replies, the city will not forgive him. Not after this, the flames flicker, and you sense the turning tide. Historians still debate whether this backlash was spontaneous outrage or quietly stirred by Stephen's enemies. Likely it was both. Outrage needs only a spark, and Stephen had lit a bonfire. His grotesque trial had turned from theatre into scandal, from scandal into sacrilege, and from sacrilege into rebellion. The city itself feels restless under your feet. The cobblestones seem to echo with whispers, the very air carrying the mutter of discontent. The cadaver synod was meant to erase Formosus' legacy, but instead it has resurrected him as a symbol of injustice. Rome has seen emperors fall for less, and you, walking quietly through the shadows, know Stephen's grip on power is loosening with every passing night. The backlash has awakened. Rome is no longer entertained. Rome is enraged. You wake to a Rome that feels cracked down the middle, like a jug left too close to the hearthfire. By dawn, the rumour is not rumour anymore. The city has turned on Stephen VI. You trace the day by its noises, first the low murmur in the alleys, then the sharper chatter in the markets, and finally the hard-edged clatter of boots on stone as men move with a purpose the city hasn't seen since an emperor last tried to look confident on a balcony. You follow the swell of voices toward the Lateran, and you can taste it in the air, the moment when a crowd decides the performance is over and the stage belongs to them. The cadaver synod was supposed to bury a legacy. Instead, it has exhumed a fury. Stephen strides through his chambers like a man walking across thin ice, sensing the hollowness beneath each step. For a day or two, he tries to proceed as if nothing has changed. Meetings, edicts, the ordinary blizzard of parchments. But even the courtiers who were once eager to nod now look at the floor. You notice servants moving with the tightly coiled care of people who suspect they may soon be asked which team they're on. By afternoon, the bells ring. Too fast, too many, clanging over one another like panicked geese. A knot of armed men pushes through the square. Their faces are not those of foreign soldiers, they're Romans. Some wear bits of armour, mismatched and dented. Others clutch spears that look like they were borrowed from the family wall decor. It is a spontaneous militia of indignation, and it has business with the Pope. Historians still argue whether these men were stirred up by rival nobles or simply answered the call of their own scandalised consciences. Either way, they move with the determination of people who've had quite enough theatre for 1 week. At the palace gates, the guards hesitate. You can almost see the math flickering in their eyes. One furious city on one side, one increasingly friendless pope on the other. Loyalties soften under that kind of arithmetic. A few guards step aside, others put up a token protest, then decide they've had a long day and would prefer a longer life. The crowd surges in like a tide. Inside the halls that smelled yesterday of incense and wax, you now smell sweat, dust, and whatever word you prefer for "we're done here." Stephen is found, not in a chapel bathed in holy light, not at an altar with hands raised to heaven, but in a chamber cluttered with papers, his voice strangled not by rope, yet, but by shock. He protests, as men do when the ground takes a sudden interest in becoming the ceiling. He declares himself the vicar of Christ, denounces his enemies, promises punishments. But the words sound small against the clatter, like a reed flute playing over thunder. You watch the moment the crowd's energy decides it's finished listening. Stephen is seized. Robes that once seemed like armour of authority now flutter like flags from a losing ship. They drag him through his own palace, and you can't help remembering the little boy who asked whether they'd cut off the dead Pope's toes. Answer, no, but today they're cutting off the patience of an entire city. Stephen is marched to confinement, sources say a prison, likely within or near the Lateran precincts, though some narrators nudge the story toward the looming hulks of Roman fortifications. What's certain, and you feel it in the flatness of the air, is that the papal voice has been pressed into silence. Word travels faster than bread loaves disappear at a hungry table. Markets that buzzed with gossip yesterday now hum with something steadier. Vindication. A fishmonger declares he'll finally trust the Tiber again once Rome repents. A water seller jokes that he knew the trial was cursed the minute the deacon tried to defend a man who couldn't blink. A cobbler mutters that shoes last longer than this papacy. You allow yourself a sleepy smile. Even in revolution, Rome keeps its standards for punchlines. In cloisters, the shift is quieter. Some bishops cross themselves and weep softly. Grief not for Stephen, but for the desecration that led here. Others allow a breath they've been holding since the fingers clattered on stone. A few whisper that God is not mocked, that even in a city of marble and mischief, a line remains that must not be crossed. You sense the relief of men who feared their ordinations might dissolve like wax near a furnace, and now dare to hope that tomorrow they'll still be bishops when the bells ring prime. The official reckoning is brisk. Stephen is deposed. The phrase lands like a stone dropped into a still basin. No splash, just a heavy certainty. You recall the mainstream thread historians repeat. In the summer of 897, not long after the Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI is removed from office, imprisoned, and, before the season fully turns, found dead in his cell. Chroniclers say strangled. Rome says, in its dry way, that a man who put a corpse on trial should have thought longer about doors that lock from the outside. You don't linger on the mechanics, sleep-friendly storytelling and all that, but you recognise the arc, hubris, backlash, fall. Yet even here, the details blur and shimmer. Some sources hint at suicide, others insist on murder at the hands of his jailers. Historians still argue whether Stephen met his end by his own despair or by a cord supplied by enemies in the dark. You drift between those possibilities the way torchlight drifts on a wall, never fully still, never fully certain, while the only steady fact remains. His rule crumbles, and swiftly. In the city, the temperature of talk cools from fury to relief. You hear a baker joke that he'll sleep better now that no one is yelling at corpses before breakfast. A scribe says he's filed today's events under "We'll pretend this never happened," a folder already crowded in the papal archives. And a grandmother, the sort who always has the last word, taps a rosary and murmurs that mercy and justice finally remembered their lines. 3 light laughs in one paragraph. Rome approves. You find yourself circling back to the spectacle's oddest residue, the way theatre becomes law and then drifts back to theatre. Stephen tried to convert stagecraft into verdict, robes, a puppet voice, the knife at the fingers. But the audience did not buy the script. It turns out you can choreograph humiliation and still lose the crowd, especially when you confuse reverence with rage. The city that once cheered at the Colosseum now rejects a different arena, deciding that some performances aren't sport but sacrilege. There's a rumour, because of course there is, that when Stephen was hauled away, a gust of wind rattled the doors of the basilica and snuffed a cluster of candles near the chair where Formosus had been strapped. People take that as a sign because people like signs. You stand in the doorway of the memory and let the draught brush past your face, cool and faintly sweet with old incense. Whether the wind means anything, you leave to the poets. It makes a good story, and Rome has always tithed generously to good stories. By evening, the streets grow gentler, torches gleam, the Tiber slips by with its usual indifferent hush. You remember, with a soft snort, the market rumour that the river refused to keep what had been thrown into it. True or not, the idea comforts the city. Rivers correct us. They carry away heat until our words sound like ourselves again. Tonight, Rome sounds tired but sane. Stephen's cell is dark. The palace corridors he stormed through go quiet, save for the scuff of a guard's sandal. In your ear, the day's rattle fades into a low, steady murmur. What just happened was not reform, not policy, not even theology, really. It was the most Roman thing of all, a verdict of memory. The crowd decided the papacy is not a toy, that death is not a prop, that dignity, once trampled, pushes back with a stubborn ancient force. You lean on a warm wall and breathe, feeling the city exhale with you. The instigator is in chains, his rule evaporated like July rain. You don't gloat, Rome doesn't either. It simply files the day under lessons learned and turns its face toward tomorrow, where other popes will try other scripts, and the audience will, as ever, decide what deserves applause. Rome does not linger long in silence. It never does. The fall of Stephen VI leaves behind not only a power vacuum but also a stench of unfinished business. The cadaver synod may have ended with a dead pope in the river and a living pope strangled in prison, but the questions it raised do not wash away as easily as the Tiber's current. They linger like incense clinging to a robe, faint but unmistakable. In the months and years that follow, Rome begins to unravel and then stitch itself back together, patch by uneasy patch. You walk through those years in your mind, watching one council after another wrestle with the mess Stephen left behind. At first, there's relief. Stephen is gone, good riddance. But relief does not equal resolution. The Church must decide what to do with Formosus' memory, and what to do with the grotesque precedent of putting a corpse on trial. The first move comes swiftly. The very year Stephen falls, the new pope, Romanus his successor, convenes a council. The cadaver synod is denounced, its verdicts are repealed, Formosus' ordinations are declared valid again. In short, the entire trial is rolled back, as though the city itself wants to hit undo on the nightmare. Historians still argue whether Romanus acted out of genuine conviction, or simply bowed to pressure from the furious clergy and laity. But the result is the same. The stain is scrubbed, at least officially, and yet you know how stains work. Even when washed, they leave a faint outline. For years afterward, councils revisit the issue. One pope confirms the repeal, another, Theodore II, orders Formosus' body recovered from the Tiber and reburied with honour in St. Peter's. Chroniclers record this moment with a kind of reverent relief. The corpse, pulled from the river, is placed back in consecrated ground, as if to tell the world, dignity is restored. You imagine a solemn procession this time, torches burning steady, clergy chanting, no jeers from the crowd, only quiet contrition for what had been done. Later still, Pope John IX takes it further. He calls a synod in Ravenna, condemns the cadaver synod once more, and decrees that no pope may ever try his predecessor after death. It's a safeguard, a legal padlock on the door Stephen once smashed open. The church seems to breathe easier, as if telling itself, we won't let this happen again. You picture bishops nodding, scribes scribbling, everyone eager to move on, to file the cadaver synod under monstrous error and never revisit it. But then, just when you think the story is settled, another twist arrives. A later pope, Sergius III, once an ally of Stephen, reverses course again. In his reign, decades after the spectacle, he declares the cadaver synod valid once more. Imagine the whiplash. Bishops who had once been re-legitimised by John IX now wonder if they've been delegitimised again. Rome has always loved chaos, but even for Rome this is dizzying. Historians still debate whether Sergius acted out of personal loyalty, political expediency, or sheer stubbornness. For the faithful on the ground, the back and forth feels exhausting. One year their sacraments are valid, the next they're not, then valid again. It's like trying to walk across a bridge that keeps turning into a rope and back into stone. You picture an exasperated priest throwing up his hands and saying, Fine, I'm both valid and invalid. Somebody just tell me if I can celebrate Mass tomorrow. And yet, even with the confusion, something important happens. The church begins to define itself not by spectacle, but by reaction to spectacle. The cadaver synod becomes a warning, a shadow haunting every council, every papal decree. Whenever later popes argue about authority, the memory of Formosus strapped in a chair hovers in the background like a ghost, whispering, "This is how far madness can go." You stroll past the Lateran in your imagination, years after the synod, and the place feels quieter, heavier with memory. Guards stand straighter, bishops walk more carefully, as though the stones themselves remember the madness and demand better. You sense that Rome, though it has returned to its noisy rhythm, carries an undercurrent of caution whenever papal politics grow heated. Among the people, Formosus's image softens. Once accused of ambition and betrayal, he becomes remembered instead as a victim, even a martyr. Stories of miracles linger. Prayers answered at his grave, light seen at his tomb. Pilgrims begin to speak of him with reverence. The man once dragged through the streets becomes, in death, a figure of dignity reclaimed. You realise how strange history can be. Yesterday's disgraced corpse becomes tomorrow's saintly memory, depending on who's telling the tale. The cadaver synod itself, though condemned and repealed, never truly fades. It becomes a cautionary tale retold whenever power seems to lurch toward excess. The councils may have tried to erase it, to restore dignity, to lock the door against future madness. But memory is harder to repeal than decrees. The story lingers, as absurd and grotesque as the day it happened, carried through centuries like a rumour that never dies. And you, drifting deeper into the rhythm of this story, feel the city exhale. Rome has stumbled, blasphemed, corrected, and stumbled again. But beneath it all, the church learns, slowly, painfully, that some lines should not be crossed, that even in a city of spectacle, there are acts too grotesque to repeat. The repeal, the reversal, the redemption, they do not erase the cadaver synod, but they transform it from an act into a lesson, from a scandal into a warning. And warnings, unlike trials, do not end. They echo. Time drifts onward, but the echo of the cadaver synod refuses to fade. You picture yourself wandering centuries after those torchlit nights, across the same Roman streets where gossip once curdled into outrage. The cobblestones are still there, the Tiber still flows, St. Peter's still rises in solemn grandeur. Yet the memory of that strange trial lingers, not as law anymore, but as legend. Scholars will never tire of debating it. Some argue Stephen VI was insane, undone by paranoia and wine-soaked fury. Others claim he was a pawn, manipulated by noble factions who wanted Formosus's legacy undone. Still others see him as a ruthless opportunist, grasping at power in a way only Rome could stage. Historians still argue whether the cadaver synod was the product of madness or calculation, but you realise the truth is probably both. Power and paranoia make excellent bedfellows. The story lives on, not just in the dusty parchments of clerks, but in the imaginations of people who love scandal as much as sanctity. You can almost hear a medieval grandmother whispering it to her grandchildren, "And then, children, the Pope dragged his enemy's corpse into court." The little ones would squeal in delight and horror, the way children always do when the line between the grotesque and the comic blurs. You smile at the irony. The cadaver synod, meant to erase Formosus's name, instead immortalised him. He's remembered far more vividly than many popes who reigned quietly, whose policies mattered, but whose stories lacked scandal. It is Stephen, raging in crimson before a corpse, and Formosus, slumped in silence, who endure in memory. Rome, city of theatre, ensured that. Centuries later, when humanists and Enlightenment thinkers sifted through the Church's history, they paused at this tale and shook their heads. A pope, putting a corpse on trial, sounded like satire, like the work of a playwright mocking papal excess. Yet it was real, recorded by multiple chroniclers, debated in councils, whispered in taverns. You can almost hear the chuckle of Voltaire centuries later, delighted at such absurd proof that human folly is eternal. And here you are, drifting into sleep, realising that history's strangest moments often outlast the solemn ones. The cadaver synod wasn't a turning point in doctrine, nor a milestone of policy. It was a fever dream, a grotesque spectacle. Yet it has echoed through time precisely because it was so strange, so unbelievable that no one could forget it. You imagine walking once more along the Tiber, its waters whispering softly in the night. Somewhere beneath the current, in the memory of the river, lies the image of Formosa's body floating in silence, carried away, yet never gone. Rome has changed 1,000 times since, yet the river remembers. And so do we. As you let your eyes close, you realise the story is not just about popes or politics. It's about the absurdity of power, the fragility of dignity, and the way human beings can transform even death into theatre. It's about how history, with all its solemn decrees and holy vestments, sometimes tilts sideways into comedy so dark it makes you shiver. And it's about how, centuries later, you can lie in bed, listening to the story and feel the weight of that absurd night as though you were there. And now the tale softens, the torches burn low, the crowds disperse, the corpse is gone, the river flows, the city sighs, and the night falls quiet again. Rome, eternal and restless, carries on, and you, drifting deeper, can let the noise fade into silence. Now the story slows, the cadence softens. You're no longer in the torchlit basilica or the crowded Roman square. You're somewhere quieter, gentler, with shadows stretching long, and the air carrying only the faintest of echoes. The absurdity, the fury, the spectacle. All of it fades now, leaving behind a hush as soft as dust settling on stone. You let your mind drift over what you've heard, robes stripped away, fingers severed, crowds whispering, a pope raging before a corpse. And yet none of it needs your attention anymore. Those voices belong to the past, a dream that has already burned itself out. The river has carried it away, the city has forgotten its anger, and time has smoothed over the jagged edges. What was once a scandal is now only a story, distant and strange. You breathe slowly, deeply. Imagine the Tiber at night, the water sliding past stone bridges, calm and steady. No torches, no shouting, just the sound of water moving endlessly onward. The river doesn't hurry, doesn't fight, doesn't rage. It just flows, and in its flowing, it erases sharpness, softens everything into memory. And so too does your own mind as you sink deeper into rest. The story has done its work, carrying you through the odd corridors of history and now setting you down gently at its quiet edge. You're safe here. The dead stay buried, the city sleeps, and so can you. Let the voices fade, let the lights dim, let the rhythm of your breath join the steady rhythm of the river. Slowly, softly, everything falls quiet. Sweet dreams,